Okay, well, I think we've got everyone for now, so let's get going. So, morning, everyone. Welcome to Farscape's latest webinar, and hello again if you've joined us before and have found our previous webinars useful. And I guess for those of you joining us for the first time, I hope you find it useful, and we see you again. We've decided to both present today because this is a particular topic that we're both pretty passionate about, and I guess it underpins almost everything we do at Farscape in the work that we do with both individuals, teams, and organisations. So we thought, yeah, we were both keen to sort of share our collective thoughts on this topic today. And I think the reason why we are so interested in it is whether we are working with teams or individuals in the work we've done over the last couple of years specifically. Um, Whatever the challenges that the organisation or the individual has presented us with, 9 times out of 10, it often boils down to the basic sort of skills and tenets of having good conversations with people at work just isn't there. And so we felt this was a timely opportunity to visit this topic and sort of share some of the insights and experiences we've collated over the last couple of years working with various organisations. Ruth, anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Hi, everybody. I think it's also interesting for us that we sent out an email to some of our regular webinar attendees to ask them what kind of topics they would like us to cover. And this was one of the ones that came back as being obviously of real interest to a lot of people around, okay, so how can we help businesses to have a more effective conversation culture? And so when we were thinking about this topic, we started to think about how could you define a conversation culture, and in what way is it different to a coaching culture? Because one of the things that we are often asked about is how can we as an organization develop a coaching culture? And from our point of view, the two things, whilst there are many overlaps, they are different, and certainly we feel that one is probably preferable to the other in terms of an underpinning approach. And so in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we'll talk a little bit about that definition of the coaching culture versus the conversation culture, and then looking at, well, is one better than the other? And then also, why bother? Does it even matter? Does an organisation need to have a conversation or a coaching culture, or is it not necessary to be so deliberate about trying to create that kind of culture? Then for those people who are interested in developing more of a conversation culture, how would you start to go about developing it? And crucially, what gets in the way of it developing? Because there are certainly quite a few barriers that, in our experience, can get in the way. We'll then pull together all of our thinking and give everybody the opportunity to ask any questions that they've got. So you'll see that you've got a chat box on your screen. So please do type any questions that you've got in there. We'll keep an eye on those questions as they're coming in. If we know we're going to address that question during the course of the webinar, we'll make sure that we flag it when we do. But if not, we'll then kind of do a mop-up at the end of any questions that haven't been covered by the overall content. So let's get stuck into talking about the definitions then of a coaching culture versus a conversation culture. So from our point of view, the coaching culture tends to be seen as a replacement to the more traditional kind of performance conversations that happen through the more annual appraisal approach. And organizations are sort of moving away from this sense of let's just save everything up to once a year and have those conversations, giving feedback about something you did 6 months ago as part of your appraisal, and moving more towards managers having regular in-the-moment coaching conversations. So I think that's what really defines a coaching culture for us, is around this whole idea of managers being able to have these regular in-the-moment coaching conversations.
And Ruth, can I just start with and ask you a quick question there, just from, I know because you've had quite a lot of experience with some of our clients in the last couple of years. The way I've heard you describe it there is that's very much about why an organisation has chosen to go for a coaching culture, but doesn't necessarily mean they've thought through how they're going to go about it and whether it's the right solution.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it does tend to be driven by a move away from that sort of older style of performance conversations through those annual appraisals, where everything's saved up, and towards this kind of more regular, let's just have the coaching conversation in the moment in a timely manner. But in itself, that doesn't define what a coaching culture is, as you rightly say. So I think in terms of then defining, so what would it look like if you had a coaching culture? Then, as well as those sort of regular in the moment conversations, you're also then moving away from the manager being the expert. So in an environment where there's a coaching culture, managers don't give the answers, they're helping people to find the answers. I think one of the challenges that we notice, though, Neil, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, is that often businesses talk about wanting a coaching culture, but actually what they mean, or perhaps inadvertently get, is more of a mentoring culture, because I think it's quite difficult for the manager who sits in that position of being in charge of the team. They've got a lot of knowledge themselves, and of course they've got the driver of needing the team to perform. It's really difficult for them to put aside their own knowledge and their own agenda to just purely coach. And so this kind of coaching culture idea often, I think, gets slightly diluted or muddied by the fact that actually it gets mistaken for mentoring sometimes.
Yeah, and I think the thing for me is, I think the people in our world, so those people who are on the webinar today in the L&D world and HR world, have probably got a very strong idea of what coaching is and what that would look like as a culture. I think what then becomes a problem is whether you get senior leaders who've heard about it or read about it somewhere and then say they want it without really knowing what that would involve to create. I mean, I can think of an example in the last 12 months where I was with a client where it was the senior leader who opened it. And then when described to them, so this is what coaching would look and sound like if you were doing it well, they were like, oh my God, we don't want that. That sounds horrendous. That sounds like it would take up so much time. And why would we want, and it's, it was clearly more mentor and directing that they were talking about and giving direct feedback. So yeah, I think it is really important to make sure that everyone is clear on what would that be. If we really wanted that and we were doing it well, what would that actually look and sound like? And I think there's a lot of confusion there sometimes.
I think I agree, and I think also one of the challenges in trying to create a coaching culture specifically, and we're going to come on to talk about conversation culture, but a coaching culture is then about how do you equip managers with those skills and capabilities to coach. And I think with limited time and training, there tends to be a kind of fairly basic understanding of something like grow, which is great in itself. But I think when people then haven't got that broader or deeper experience of coaching, they sort of doggedly follow the grow model, but don't necessarily recognise when that might not be the moment to use it, or when they perhaps need to take a sort of slightly different approach. But I think where organisations do it well, then coaching isn't an activity that one does. It's more of a management approach. So it's not kind of formal coaching. It's about managing in a coaching style. So managers would be asking open questions, would be listening with real positive intent. As I say, not sort of seeking to give the answers, helping people to kind of find the answers for themselves. But that takes quite a lot of sophistication and practice for somebody to be able to deliver that kind of coaching.
Yeah, and time to practice.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay.
So then if we were to move on to then what's a conversation culture then, and this is something that we're finding we're doing more and more of with the clients that we work with, this is more about a recognition of the value of paying attention to good quality conversations and the rewards that can be reaped as a result of that. And I think this links to the previous slide around coaching culture. Actually, there are lots of different kinds of conversation that need to happen in businesses and organizations. And part of a conversation culture is recognizing what those conversations are and when they need to happen. So they could be coaching conversations, but it could equally be mentoring or giving feedback or training or exchanging information. Coaching isn't the only one, and no one approach will fit all of those different requirements. And so actually, part of having a good conversation culture is managers recognizing what kind of conversation needs to happen in this moment, and what role do I need to play? Do I play the role of coach now? Do I play the role of mentor? Am I just training this person? And I think that ability to notice and adapt in a conversation culture makes it a very powerful place to be.
And I think that's it for me, Ruth, that in the work that we've done certainly over the last sort of 12 months with managers of all levels, I find it increasingly surprising how, if you ask them to come up with what are the different types of conversations that go on, people, it sounds like a really basic question, but people really struggle with that because there's normally a culture within an organization where people default to one or two styles. So I'm either telling you what to do, or I'm chasing you up to see if you've done it, or I'm giving you some feedback on how you've done it badly. And as you've just pointed out, there are so many more subtleties in the sort of conversations that need to happen if we, if organisations want to develop a culture in general that is more engaging and motivational for their staff. And I think that is the key bit of this, isn't it? Is that helping people to notice what is the conversation that you need to have, and what's the style in which you need to deliver it for it to have the most impact.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think actually then that's about giving people the underpinning skills to be able to have effective conversations and to be able to notice what conversation needs to happen. And so actually for us, some work around helping people to be genuinely curious. So recognizing that actually stop, take a step back from what your agenda might be in this conversation and be curious about the other person is a really powerful part of a strong conversation culture. Understanding what listening means. And I think it always makes me smile when we're delivering programs in some of our clients' organizations where we ask about listening and people say, well, you need to look like you're listening. And actually starting to unpick that and helping people to recognize that it's not about playing a role of listening, it's about genuinely listening and what that means. And then asking powerful questions. I think questions is something that people get very much into the habit of asking closed questions, which are very narrowing. And even though they know the difference between open and closed questions, they don't tend to use open questions. Holding a positive intention when they go into a conversation. I think a lot of people go into a conversation with an intention of, I need you to understand my point of view, or I need to interrupt you to tell you what I need you to do, or I want to make sure that you get the fact that you've done this wrong. And actually going into a conversation with a positive intention, i.e., I'm here to listen to understand, or I'm here to really make you feel valued, can have a huge impact and shift in terms of how positively that conversation is experienced. And then obviously the removing of assumptions and biases, which we can't do, but by noticing them and being conscious of how our assumptions and biases might be impacting, that really helps to minimize their impact. And I think all of those things are skills which underpin a really healthy conversation culture and which allow people to then start to notice more what kind of conversation does this need to be, as opposed to, as you say, just falling back on, oh, well, this is the style of conversation I always have.
Yeah, and just on that last point, just one thing to finally add before we move on is, I think the other thing that we increasingly notice is people start to realize that the only conversations they are having are purely transactional. They're carried out on a functional basis. So, I'm finance, your sales. We're talking about, this is all we're talking about. We sort of lose sight of the fact that there's an individual sat there that has a life outside of the office, and what goes on, internally, and their personality, their values, their emotions have a massive impact on their ability to operate. So if we only ever talk functionally, we never get be sort of behind that veneer, do we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where that being genuinely curious comes in as well. So it stops people from just focusing on the what function and role do you play, and gets deeper into who are you as a person, what are the things that are, what's going on for you at the moment, what are the things that make you tick. And yeah, that can be really helpful. So I think then in terms of is one better than the other, I'm sure what's been clear from what we've said so far is that we're not saying that coaching is wrong. Certainly coaching can be a great tool, and if it's used wisely and at the right time, then absolutely it's great to have that within an organization. And Neil, you and I are both coaches. We do a lot of coaching and both are real advocates of the power of coaching. And so, for example, someone may be struggling with their confidence and they could benefit from a coaching conversation to help them explore what's leading to that lack of confidence. But equally, it may be that somebody is just struggling with a piece of technical knowledge, and actually trying to coach them is just going to cause frustration and irritation because they just want someone to tell them what they don't know. And hence the kind of picture on the screen here is, if all you've got is a hammer, everything starts to look a bit like a nail. And I think that is the real problem sometimes with a coaching culture, that managers start to feel so much as though they've got to coach that they stop recognizing that but this isn't the moment for coaching. And I think when we're trying to use the wrong tool, it starts to give that tool a bad reputation as well. And I know that we've gone into organisations who talked about coaching in a very negative light. And I think that's often where it's tried to sort of be used too much or in the wrong situation. Yeah. And so from our point of view, it is just that they're different. And the key is to be clear about the purpose of the conversation and the outcome that's needed, and then choose appropriately. And that really a conversation culture not only underpins coaching, but it also underpins effective mentoring, training, giving feedback, and that if you can invest time and money and paying attention to the kind of the skills and characteristics and qualities of good conversations, then actually all of those different things should, as a result, improve.
Mm.
So why bother though? Because I guess there will be some businesses out there who feel that, okay, so we haven't got that kind of culture, but does it really matter? Because what we're doing, it kind of works, we're getting the results that we need. And I think the thing that we've noticed during our time of working with lots of different organisations around this topic is that there's often an avoidance of conversations, particularly conversations that are seen to be difficult. And people are sort of trading that short-term discomfort for long-term dysfunction. And we start to see some symptoms of a lack of a conversation culture. And so I've popped a few on the slide here. And so one of the things, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but one of the things that we often notice is that managers are holding on to work and not delegating. Now that might not seem like an obvious symptom of a lack of conversation culture, but it tends to be to do with the fact that managers have perhaps passed work on in the past and haven't communicated effectively what's required of somebody. So their ability to delegate well isn't there. And then when they haven't got what they need, they haven't then known how to have an effective conversation to rectify that or to remedy it or to help somebody understand what they might need to do differently. So they get into a habit of just holding on to work and not delegating. So then they are then run ragged. They're not giving that kind of challenge and development downwards, but they're also getting to a place of being completely overwhelmed themselves. So that tends to be one of the symptoms. That link to that then is that people aren't then giving timely feedback. And so you see bad behaviours persisting because people just don't want to address those difficult things. They might feel nervous or anxious about having that kind of conversation, or they might just feel that they don't want to face it. So you then sort of see a culture where bad behaviours are allowed to continue and to persist. I think another symptom is that appraisal systems aren't valued or bought into. And I know that we've spoken to a number of our clients who feel really frustrated about the fact that they've invested a lot of time and money into an appraisal system that people just kind of pay lip service to, if that. And it tends to be seen as this kind of thing that we've got to do once a year, and we go through the motions and then it gets stuck in a drawer until next year. And as a result of that, the conversations themselves that happen during the appraisal aren't impactful because people aren't valuing them or seeing that they have any purpose.
And just on that one, Ruth, I mean, what's been interesting to notice as well in the marketplace is that as more and more companies are moving towards an appraisal system that has more regular feedback, to spread throughout the year, there are some great bits of software out there now that businesses are buying into to capture all that feedback. But I think often then that's seen as, oh, this is the solution. But ultimately, they're bits of software that just capture what's been said in a conversation. So it doesn't, those bits of software don't enable the conversations. You've still got to be having those regular conversations to be able to fill it in on the software. So I think, that can be a bit of a dead end for some organizations that software will solve it, but which it will. It'll be a great way to sort of capture it and sort of curate that feedback. But you still will be having those quality conversations going on a regular basis to generate the input in the first place.
Yeah, and I think all the more so people need to recognise the value in those conversations, because then they're being asked to then do an extra job, which is to fill some stuff in online or in a piece of software. And so there's got to be that drive. Yeah, that drive to say, no, this is a really valuable thing to do. And certainly we've come across that a lot, haven't we? I think then the sort of lack of challenge and development that can sometimes result from that lack of conversation happening can lead people leaving. And also, perhaps worse still, is a culture of fear developing. And I've talked a little bit here about, or I mentioned the threat drive loop, and I just want to touch upon some stuff around neuroscience, which I think is really relevant and interesting to this whole idea of a culture of fear. I'm not going to spend ages on this because I'm sure a lot of people who are listening know already a lot about the evolution of the brain, but just to kind of mention a couple of relevant points. In terms of how the brain evolved, the oldest part of the brain, so the reptilian brain, is responsible for our autonomic functions, so the fact that we're breathing, heart rate, pulse, all of those kind of things. And then the next part of the brain that developed was the limbic part of the brain, or the mammalian brain, and that's the part of the brain that houses our emotions, and particularly the amygdala, which is responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze response. And what we tend to find in organisations that are driven more by fear is that this threat response, the fight, flight, or freeze, is switched on or is overactive. And certainly in terms of how our brains respond to perceived threat, even if that is social threat rather than an actual threat to our safety, we tend to, if a brain isn't sure, it'll err on the side of this is a threat rather than it's not a threat. And then that's become complicated by the continuing evolution of the brain into the kind of the neocortex, which is the newest part of the brain, the thinking brain, which houses all of our ability to ruminate, imagine, make decisions, think, be logical, etc. And what we tend to find is that there's a kind of tricky relationship between the old brain, the parts of the brain which are all about the emotions, and the new brain, which is all about the kind of thinking and reasoning. And so a good way to describe that is to think about zebras. So when zebras are eating grass and a lion appears, their response is the fight, flight, or freeze response. So it's that limbic part of the brain kicks in, and they are all about surviving. So they, as you can see in this picture, they flee. But then when the lion's gone away again, they are able to, that part of the brain switches off, and they're able to return to eating grass without worrying about what might happen. So in human brains, the thinking part of the brain gets then involved, and we respond to a threat. But even when that threat has then gone, the thinking part of the brain starts to ruminate about, well, why did that happen to me, and what might happen if it comes again, and how am I going to cope in a situation where that particular threat comes back. So those threats may be about too much work, they may be about a poor communication style with a boss, they could be all sorts of things at work that are sort of more social threats, but that trigger that limbic part of the brain into fight, flight, or freeze. But then we get stuck in a loop where our brain starts to think about it and imagine what might happen next time and worry about what might happen next time. And suddenly we're in this place where fear is being perpetuated. And sort of finally, on that point, I think this is a really interesting kind of concept around the different motivational centers of the brain. And this is something one of our colleagues, Dr. Nilisha Wickramasinghe, has been working on a lot. So the interactions between what we call the threat brain and the drive brain. So in terms of how these three different centers work, we've talked about the threat brain, that fight, flight, or freeze. The safe brain is a part of our brain that developed in response to our need to nurture our young as mammals, and how much that impacted on our survival rates. And so that safe part of the brain is all about deep thinking and connection, and that sort of emotional connection with another being. The drive part of the brain is all about accumulating, achieving, overcoming, seeking excitement, adventure. But what can happen is when the threat part of the brain is activated by poor communication style from our boss, by feedback being given in a really bad way, we then go into drive brain, which is all about, I've got to overcome this, I've got to work harder, I've got to prove that I'm not that person, I've got to prove that I can achieve this. We get stuck into a very toxic loop between our threat brain and our drive brain. And we then start to see symptoms of things like stress, or long-term anxiety, illness, low morale, poor attendance. So what can seem like quite a simple thing around how can we have effective conversations, actually when you start to look at it at that neurological level, where bad conversations are happening or toxic conversations are happening, you really start to see a huge impact on the organisation and how it performs and how people are coping in that sort of fear-based environment. And so there suddenly becomes a real imperative to have a really positive, healthy conversation culture. And then the final point now on that side is around a lack of trust. And certainly we recognise that effective conversations can have a hugely positive impact on the level of trust in a business or in an organisation. And so I think this trust equation is quite a nice way of looking at that, particularly intimacy. So where effective conversations happen, where people are genuinely curious, where they listen effectively, where they ask good questions, you start to increase the level of intimacy that exists. And intimacy is part of the equation that increases trust. Conversely, in terms of this equation, self-interest and self-orientation are the things that start to reduce it. So actually where conversations aren't about being genuinely curious, where they aren't about really listening with a positive intent, and they're much more about self-interest and self-orientation, you start to see trust decreasing in an organisation. And so again, it really shows how important it is to have a positive conversation culture. And I'm sure lots of people listening are familiar with Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, but at the base of his model is all around the importance of trust. So in a dysfunctional team, there's an absence of trust. So people fear being vulnerable, so they won't be vulnerable, and they fear conflict. And I think that's the key part around conversations, is that it's not okay to disagree. They fear that kind of sense of conflict because of it makes them vulnerable. What might people then use against them? What are different people's agendas? And as a result of that, you start to see that lack of commitment, lack of accountability. I'm not willing to start holding other people to account because this doesn't feel like a safe place. And therefore, results aren't paid attention to. People are very much looking after their own status and ego. And so actually, again, that kind of simple words of a conversation culture has a huge impact in terms of how an organisation performs and how functional or dysfunctional it is. So final point on that really is about, so why should we bother discussing feelings? Because essentially that's what we're talking about in a conversation culture. It's about people willing to be open and to talk. And some of the points we've captured on this slide are all around that openness and honesty that develops that sense of trust. And then you get that enhanced productivity because people are open and communicating well. And then linking back to that fear-based organisation, you're reducing stress and anxiety and fear because it's okay to have those open conversations, and people are learning how to have those conversations effectively in a way that doesn't create that fight, flight or freeze response. They do it in a way that is supportive, nurturing, interested, using really good listening and questioning skills. And so you start to see more effective relationships developing. People are then willing to be accountable and take ownership. And you've got loads of brilliant safe brain thinking, which is where people are at their most creative and most able to do their best work. So there's a lot of science that supports this idea that having a good conversation culture is really positive for an organisation. And so going back to the Lencioni slide here, actually, if you then flip that around, when you've got a really strong basis of trust, people are willing to be vulnerable and they're able to have conflict. And I think that's one of the really important parts of a conversation culture, is that people are now in a position to be able to have those what can be perceived as difficult conversations effectively, where it's okay to disagree and it's okay to challenge, because we know that it's healthy and it's not going to be then used against you later on down the line. And so people will have conflict, they will disagree, and then they will commit, and then so on up that triangle through commitment and accountability to a place where results are really focused on as a team and not about individual survival. So lots of really important science around why bother, why it is important.
Yeah.
But that's probably all kind of easier said than done. It sounds great to say it. So I know that Neil, you're going to now go on to talk about, so what do you need to be able to do to start?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It sort of ties into a question that's been posed. Is that what happens if you've got an organisation where actually managers are telling people to stop talking if it's not if it's not about work. How do you? I mean, it doesn't help morale, and if it's not work related, how do you prove that it's that conversation is important? So I mean, hopefully, what you've just been talking about there, Ruth, sort of sets some of that out. And I think the place to start, I think, if an organisation is thinking of going down this road, is this sort of the point we've got up here at top left is, and I think the important word on that sort of circle there is the acknowledgement. So Ruth, you've described some of the symptoms that are often noticed or start to be noticed in an organisation, but often they're then not acknowledged that they're then having an impact. So people know that these symptoms are there, but no one's talking about it. So I think the first step is doing some of that internal noticing or diagnosis, if you like, and saying, so what are our symptoms? What are we noticing in the business, and what impact are they having on what are those symptoms that have an impact? So whether it is, and rather than repeating everything you've said, Ruth, but the whole thing around well-being is a massive topic in organisations at the moment, and especially mental well-being. And I think the important thing that comes across for us, tying into the thing you've just talked about discussing emotions and feelings and their role in people's productivity, is it's just nonsense to imagine that people walking through the door at work and their emotions switch off and are no longer having an impact on the way that they're thinking. And all of the research in the recent years from neuroscience and psychology just proves the opposite, that if you want people who are doing their best quality thinking, are really creative, are good problem solvers, can, think innovatively, can, think laterally, and deal in this new, uncertain, and volatile, marketplace, then they need to feel psychologically safe. And good quality conversations are a great way of doing that. So the first bit is acknowledging that's there. I think the other one in terms of those symptoms of acknowledging is, what's motivating people. And so, if you are noticing symptoms of low morale, low engagement, then often one of the sort of knee-jerk reactions in organizations is to try and build in loads of extrinsic motivators. So whether that's pay and rewards and benefits, which are always great things and are probably always needed, and people will always say yes to them, but they're not intrinsic. So I'm sure some of you will have come across lots of different work on motivation, but we particularly like this model that came from Dan Pink in his book Drive, which talks about the sort of three core things that motivate people of mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So taking mastery, people are motivated if they know that they can get better at something. So if the environment's created where they can improve and show development, the autonomy one is, some people will do anything for you so long as they know that they're going to be allowed to do it in a way that works for them. So tell me what to do, but don't tell me how I've got to do it. Give me the credibility to be able to go and do it in my own way. And then finally, in purpose, people really want to know why they're doing what they're doing. So, this task that you've given me to do, of course I'll do it, but what impact is it having on the team, for the client, for the organization? What's the benefit of it? And I think this is a good one where, especially feedback conversations, if that's not happening, so even if it's praise, often people say, people we talk to, don't they, Ruth? Oh, I don't like giving negative feedback. But I think it's equally, we're not great in sort of British corporate culture at doing praise well and letting people know, what they're doing, why it's having a good, why it's having a good impact, and all that sort of thing. So I think, noticing where there's a symptom where motivation is dropping, and the only way you're going to improve that is by having good conversations with an individual to find out, well, what's the thing that motivates you? So I think that's really important for a start. I think another symptom that often comes around is this focus on results and the behaviours that drive those results, which is obviously a place to start, but it doesn't really look at what's going on below the waterline. And you touched on sort of emotions and feelings in what you described earlier, Ruth. And some of you may have seen this work before. This is reference from Dr. Alan Watkins, who wrote a book called Coherence and Coherent Leadership. And what he talks about is the fact that, every organization, it focuses on results, and then some of the better ones focus on, so what behaviors do we need to drive results? But very few then focus on what's going on below the waterline that influence people's behavior. And we all know, working in the world of L&D, that people's core values, their personality, their biases, all influence the way that they behave. But even more so, their emotions and feelings influence the way they think. That limbic part of the brain that Ruth was talking about earlier always trumps the sort of cognitive neocortex part of the brain by milliseconds. So feelings and emotions always come into it first, and the limbic brain always overrides the logical bit, unless we learn great ways of overcoming it. Those of you that might have read the chimp paradox by Dr. Steve Peters will have seen that there are ways that we can learn to do that. But if you're not having those conversations in an open, honest, and vulnerable way, so in some cases, you're not going to notice what those feelings and emotions are yourself, and you're certainly not going to notice them in others. Yet we know, as Ruth described before, in the way the brain evolved, we're a species that evolved to give and receive emotional support. So this idea that, well, you get that at home, you don't need it at work, is just nonsense. You could ignore it, but you're also ignoring the fact that will be potentially having a big significant impact on the quality of people's thinking, and therefore their productivity and results. So, ignoring all this stuff, is a real peril for a lot of organizations, because it seems too soft and fluffy, but actually directly impacts on the bottom line and the results. And organizations do it at their own cost. So, so if you acknowledge all the symptoms, what else do you do? I think the other key thing for us is the one top right, is is having a real honest assessment of the level of buy-in from the top team. Because if you genuinely want to create a culture rather than just go through a process, you've got to know that you've got their buy-in. So, and this ties in again to some of the questions that have been posed by some of you out there is, but what about if you haven't got that? Well, I suppose for us in the clients we've worked with, I guess that's where we often get involved, is because as an external independent organisation, in a way we've got nothing to lose, so we can be quite brutal and quite honest, and we can come in and have conversations with people to assess, so what really is the culture and what do people really think, um, and then you've got some real tangible data that you can sort of play back to the top team to say, this is what people think about our culture and this is what they want. Especially if you've identified that those symptoms are having a negative impact. And maybe it might then be challenging them as a top team to say, and they're not seeing it from you either. So if you were going to pilot the start of this move towards a conversation culture, if you can encourage them to be the people that try it first, and I know that's much easier to say than it is to get done, but where we've made that challenge to senior teams and they've bought into it, certainly has much stronger impact as you try and roll out a wider program across the organisation, because everyone believes that, actually, everyone's going to be bought into this.
Neil, just to quickly interject there as well, I think it's interesting in terms of the level of buy-in from the top. Sometimes there's an attitude of, we don't need to do it, it's the people below us who need to do this. And that's because they sort of think, well, we've been there, done that, we're too senior now, we know it all. But then I think it's also sometimes to do with them feeling vulnerable and having, in a sense, more to lose the more senior they are, in terms of other people in that kind of top position. Is there some jockeying for position going on? Are there some hidden agendas there? Are senior leaders worried about making themselves vulnerable, because could that make them be perceived to be weak? So there's quite a lot of complex emotional stuff that goes on up at that top level, and I think we've learned that we have to really pay attention to that and then think about how we can support them and hold that environment for them so that it feels safe for them to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the point I guess we're making as we're going through, isn't it? That it's a complex journey if you want to tackle it, because it's not just about the skills of doing it. It's also, knowing which conversations are appropriate. We just had a question asked about, sometimes often managers get too wary of too much intimacy and actually what employees are allowed to keep private and what not. And I think it is that thing for us of, the more you're having conversations, the more you're better at judging what's appropriate and what's not, because people then become more willing to be open and to be willing to share more, and then it does become more appropriate. I guess it's in those more fearful environments where it's all work that people would just never go there, because they don't feel it is appropriate. And so it's a difficult balance to strike, isn't it? But I guess if you're not having any conversations, it becomes even harder. And so I think the two bottom ones that are tied together. So one on the right is, really ensuring that if an organisation is going to go down this road, be clear from the start that, do we genuinely want to give value to the time spent having conversations of all sorts of conversations, whether that's giving feedback, directing, delegating, whether that's specific coaching conversation, mentoring, all that sort of thing. Because the problem we often hear back from a lot of the people then who engage with us, as the sort of staff on these programs is, yeah, I'd love to do more of this stuff, but my boss doesn't value it. They measure me on this list of stuff here that's my day-to-day job. So I would love to do more of this, and I think it is my job to do. But I'd be fearful of doing it because they would think I was wasting my time. So I think if you've got that culture, that's probably something that needs tackling first before you then spend time and money on upskilling everybody. And so the final area then is this one on the bottom left, is if it's a route you are definitely going to go down, then people are going to need those skills. And so for us, they're actually very simple, and these might feel like really basic things, but I think it's the one thing that surprises us, isn't it, Ruth, whenever we then run these practical sessions with people, is actually people aren't as good at it as they think. So that's one area, is helping people to notice and be more consciously aware that they have their own biases and assumptions and stories and a filter in the way they see the world that's dictated, by their own core values and personality, that stops them being curious about the other people that they work with, and enables them to shortcut by not having a conversation and make up a story about, oh, well, he's like this because of this, or she's like that because of that. And then their own behaviors change because of that story they've made up, without actually stopping, being a bit more curious, having a proper conversation and finding out what the real story is. And then maybe hopefully notice that actually, oh, we're just different. You're not wrong and I'm not wrong. We just see it differently. And that's then compelling, and that can take us to an even more productive, place. So that's really important, that, getting people to just stop and notice in the first instance that just because I see it like this doesn't mean I'm right. We were probably both right from the way we see the world. We both had unique life experiences, so we shouldn't expect to always see things the same. So
No,
I
can I just
guess,
add something to that?
yeah,
I think also in terms of a conversation culture, we talk a lot about the difference between dialogue and discussion. And in dialogue, actually difference is really valued, and it's about a kind of yes
yeah,
and. So your point of view might appear to be opposite to my point of view. At that, isn't that really interesting? And what new might be created from those two different parts, sort of schools of thought, or those two different types of thinking. Whereas where we have discussion, people kind of very much hold on to, well, this is my point of view, this is yours, and I'm going to stick here, and one of us will win. And I think that kind of sense of difference is compelling, is such an important part of that.
yeah. I mean, not that we're going to get into it today, but it then ties into that whole idea of, you know, transactional analysis and the parent-adult-child, and so often managers take that sort of critical parent role, and no, this is what I think, and this is how we're going to do it, whether you like it or not, and they're not willing to stop and be a bit more adult and say, okay, there's two possible ways that we both see it. Maybe there's a third way that if we did have a proper open dialogue, we could get to somewhere else. Absolutely. This second point then is listening, and again, people you would say, well, I'm an adult, surely I know how to listen. But I think you touched on this very early on in the presentation, Ruth, and I think people, when we work with them, realize that they're not, that often they're unconsciously listening with quite a negative intention. So it's normally, do you know what, I'm really busy, so I'm going to listen with the intention for you to shut up quite quickly because I need to move on and get on with what I'm doing. Or I'm listening for the gap in the conversation so that I can interject and tell you what I think. Whereas actually, as we've shown through a lot of the practical activities we do with groups, if you can consciously choose a positive intention whilst listening to another person, it really comes across that, you talked about the amygdala before, Ruth, in the brain, that limbic part of the brain filters all of the data that we receive and picks up on all those micro cues from other people, facial movements, all that sort of thing, physical and stuff that it hears. So, and it will really pick up if people choose a consciously choose a positive intention, but so few of us actually stop and do that. And I think that second one has one of the biggest breakthroughs for people when they work on these programs with us, that, oh, actually, yeah, this really works if I can do that. I think there's also acknowledging that when you're listening, we get distracted, whether that's visual distractions, auditory, can't speak, distractions. But if you can acknowledge it to yourself that happens and it's human nature, and just notice that happens when you're trying to listen and focus on someone else, it makes it much easier for your brain to wander off for 30 seconds thinking about something else. Because that might be the key bit of the conversation where you get some, a subtle way and they say a certain sentence or some key bit of data. So it is, it's really important for people to acknowledge that we're not as good at focusing as we think we are, and it is a real skill. And again, ties into, if you then want to develop a coaching culture, it's a massive skill as a good coach to be able to focus and not get distracted by your own thoughts. And then the final bit is the art of asking good quality questions. So it's being able to ask a good question and then stop and listen to the answer. And again, you mentioned this before, Ruth, is that lots of people have come across the concept of open and closed questions, yet don't really practice using open questions well. And again, if you can make that sort of a practical bit of training for people, really helping them to explore that and see how hard it is to do, but also notice the power of it, can be really valuable. That the power of asking a really impactful question and then holding a good silence while the other person can think and then speak without being interrupted is really powerful. And so I think that for us is one of the key skills that people need to develop. So moving on from there, that's just some of the basic skills that underpin it. These are the 4 things that you would probably do that last, because these other 3 things need to be in place for that investment of time and money, probably, to have any real impact. So, do bear that in mind. And then, so moving on from there, this all sounds really easy, like, well, why doesn't everybody do it then? Well, it's because there are loads of barriers that get in the way. And I think, again, we're, not naive enough to acknowledge that these barriers exist and that some of them are quite difficult to overcome. So I think again, this isn't an exhaustive list, and I know this graphic isn't great, so hopefully you read this, but starting at the bottom, probably the most regular thing we hear when we're working with clients is from the individual participants is, I'm just simply too busy day to day doing what I'm paid to do to invest the time in having conversations with my staff. I just don't have the space to fit it in. Which again then feeds into the point above, which is there's a strongly held perception that managers' time is valuable, and me having conversations with my staff isn't valuable use of that time. I think hopefully, as we've proved through the early part of the presentation, it absolutely is, because if the managers aren't doing it, then nobody's doing it. And we know through all the neuroscience and psychology that it will be having a detrimental effect on people's ability to think well, therefore their behaviours, and thus their productivity. So, we're kidding ourselves if we think avoiding these conversations isn't having an impact on the bottom line. And therefore it is an absolutely essential use of a good manager's time to be having these conversations. They don't see it as their remit. So again, that ties back into the culture, is that a number of times, Ruth, don't we hear, a group of managers, and it's almost incredulous to hear where they go, well, that's just not part of my job. That's not my job to, look after them and have conversations with them and find out how they're getting on. I'm just here to get them to do stuff that the business needs them to do and make sure they do it and do it well, which they won't be if you're not having these conversations. And I think then ties into something I said earlier on, is if it's not being role modeled by the senior team, then it's not likely to stick as a culture, because whether they like it or not, the people at the top of the organization are being watched all the time, and either consciously or unconsciously everybody else in the organization is taking their lead. So that bit is a critical bit, and we've done several webinars before, and how do you engage the senior team, and that's probably the hardest part of the whole process, isn't it, Ruth, is getting them on board in the process. So I think that top one then is just that overall assessment then is, what culture have we got now? What's the status quo? Because it's going to be important to notice, are people going to feel safe enough to have these conversations? And if they're not, thinking about all the stuff Ruth talked about with the safe brain loop, that's probably something that needs tackling first. So conscious of time, so just to sort of wrap up everything we've been talking about. So what would be the benefits? So if you were, if you'd sorted out some of the barriers and you were then going to try and, give some of your managers the skills, what would be the potential benefits that you could sell to the senior teams and how it would impact productivity? I think it certainly underpins, if they've heard about coaching as a culture and as a management style, anyone who's got the real basics of having good conversations is, has got all the basic tools then to become a much better coach. So coaching style as a management style is much more likely to stick, and more likely to be embedded in the organization. I think it then gives people this behavioral flexibility. So for us, that means as a manager and leader, it doesn't matter which person is in front of you and what environment you're in, you can adapt your conversational style to have the right level of impact and influence that you need to have in that moment. And it enables you to broaden your range of conversational styles and think to yourself, okay, what's the message I need to get across here? Therefore, what sort of conversation is this? And what sort of style do I need to adopt to have that impact and influence? And I think finally, if it's good quality face-to-face training, because I think this is definitely one of those areas that's better done face-to-face, it helps people to explore what their own psychological blockers are to having the right conversation, especially around giving feedback, having those challenging conversations. It's normally not that people don't know what they should be doing or how to do it. It's just that they've got their own inner dialogue going on that's stopping them doing it. And people need to be able to explore that in a safe environment to get beyond that point. So, let's summarize the last sort of 45 minutes then. What are we trying to cover here? I guess it's this point that we are social beings, and the idea that we're different at home to the way we are at work doesn't really stack up. And in both environments, we still need to be able to give and receive emotional support to each other to be able to perform effectively. And so, if we're not spending time and having genuine conversations on all topics, including work topics, we're not saying this is all about chatting about what you did at the weekend. It's definitely not just that. It shows genuine interest in me as an individual and my work role, and helps build curiosity about difference, which, as we know, is more compelling. And then, that's what enables people to find their own intrinsic motivators, to be more engaged, to take ownership. And then, managers don't have the need to hold people accountable all the time because people know that their boss is interested in them. And it creates that open culture where feedback then isn't difficult. Everybody welcomes it, encourages it, wants to receive it, values it, and it just becomes more easier to do because there isn't that psychological barrier. And as Ruth talked about before, it builds that genuine sense of trust between line managers and their teams, and that drives results because people are willing to have that healthy dialogue and have healthy conflict. Creates that safe psychological space, which goes into that safe drive loop that Ruth talked about before, which is so much healthier. And if you do then want to roll out coaching as an approach and a culture, it helps underpin it as more of an approach rather than an activity. So hopefully that summarised what we were trying to cover today. I know it's a massive topic. Hope that's been useful to people. And if you want to have a further conversation with us, we'd be more than happy to do that. Ruth, was there anything you wanted to add to wrap up on that?
I think just my finishing point is around this idea that a conversation culture underpins all of those different kinds of conversation. So whether it's coaching, mentoring, training, giving feedback, and that investment of time and money and energy in helping people to really understand what it means to have a conversation is a kind of really, it's much broader than just focusing on, hey, let's help people to be more effective coaches. And I think you're going to get so much more value from that investment. So to go back to our original question in terms of the webinar title, coaching culture versus conversation culture, and is one better than the other? I think we're not saying that one is better than the other. We're just saying that the conversation culture is broader and sits as a foundation or underpins all of those different kinds of conversations, which then enables them to be much more effective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just scanning back through all the various questions that people have posted. It looks like we've covered off all the main topics. There was one that was around how do you specifically potentially recruit for that, and are any sectors better at getting managers who have the adaptability to do this? Yeah, that would be fantastic, wouldn't it, if we knew the ultimate answer to how you recruit people who are good at doing that. Yeah, I'm not sure I've got the answer here today on that one, unfortunately, but I think
no, but I think it isn't possible to say that there are specific sectors or types of clients that have managers who do have that adaptability. I think it isn't sort of about a particular industry or sector being better at this than another. It's very much to do with the organisation and whether they, as an organisation, value the conversations and a conversation culture, and whether they've invested time in that. So I think it would be difficult to sort of pinpoint a particular sector that's better than another.
Yeah, although I suppose if you flip it, I suppose what we do see on the other end of the spectrum is there are definitely sectors that seem to avoid it more. I think especially those where their time is billable, and often it's well, this isn't good use of my time because I can't bill for this conversation. So yeah, there's definitely challenges in those professional services, aren't there, where it isn't valued. So I think that goes back to that point, and you'd have to tackle that first if you were really going to invest in it. Yeah. I think other than that, we've covered everything off. Just to remind everyone as well, we are recording this webinar, so as soon as the webinar is over, we'll be uploading that and sharing that link with you if you wanted to share it with anybody else who wasn't able to attend or didn't get the invite. So we'll make sure that that comes out to everyone. And as ever, if there are any specific topics that you'd like us to cover, always really keen to hear what you guys are interested in exploring further. So yeah, do get in touch if there's anything else you'd want to do on a subsequent webinar. I think that's all from me, Ruth. Anything else from you?
I think final point for me is that if you want to have a conversation more specifically about how this could work in your organisation, then obviously really happy to do that. And please do just drop us an email or give us a call. Very happy to talk it through with you.
Great. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you found that useful today. And yeah, if you want to continue the conversation, get in touch. Otherwise, yeah, we'll send you an email out, and you can share that with whoever you want to. So enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye now.
Bye bye.